The Atheist Debates Patreon project presents the beautiful and ugly truth about logical arguments. Before I started doing the Atheist Debates project, I would post videos on YouTube trying to, the drive home brain dumps and things like that. And for a while, I started working on a series of videos, the foundational set of things, where we started talking about logic and burden of proof and things like that. Those videos are still available. But I've been getting more and more questions, and we're going to be doing a video shortly about the mailbag questions that I get, what I think of particular arguments. But today I wanted to talk about something that may not be clear to everybody about a logical syllogism. Now, for those people who are experts in this area, this is going to be incredibly obvious, but I still think it's something that just needs to be reiterated. And I've called it the beautiful and ugly truth because when you first grasp this concept, it's a bit scary. It's a bit, well, hey, hang on a minute, I thought we were all about truth. By the way, there's some things that we're not going to talk about. We're not going to go through all the syllogistic forms and, talk about Aristotle and his band of logicians and how they demonstrated this. I just want to focus on one aspect of logical syllogisms and why it's important. So if you want to go beyond this, there's any number of things you can do. That you could just Googling logical syllogisms, Google the difference between validity and soundness. There's an article up at ironchariots.org. There's also Wikipedia entries. And there's a couple of books that I could recommend if you want to dig a little further. This one isn't cheap, actually. It's a Patrick J. Hurley's A Concise Introduction to Logic, which is an actual logic textbook that's used in colleges, which is why it doesn't come cheap. This is the 10th edition, but it doesn't matter which one you get. And for the people who aren't really wanting to dig in as much, a really good book is this one by Douglas Walton, is Informal Logic, a handbook for critical argumentation. And it goes through plain language information about arguing, about how to better recognize fallacies. I actually got this for myself when I got a copy for a friend of mine because we were having this discussion. And I thought it'd be great to keep on my shelf, even though I haven't, actually read the entire book. I've gone through it and looked to make sure that there's good information in there. But I wanted to talk about syllogisms, the how and why we use them, and this confusion that people have about truth. So what is truth? Do we even have access to the truth? These are questions in philosophy that are argued about almost ad nauseum. You would think that it would be obvious. Truth is that which is. But because we have to interpret the world based on the information we get from our senses, this is a kind of a problem for philosophers that they struggle with. Is there such a thing as truth, or do we view everything relative? We're not going to dig in on these big topics about truth for the reason that they don't matter to logical syllogisms. So for the sake of this, we'll just say anytime I'm talking about truth, I'll use my standard definition of truth is that which comports with reality. Whether or not we can confirm reliably or absolutely what actually conforms with reality is a separate issue. Now, the simplest logical syllogism from the sort of propositional logic structure would have two premises that include one item that is linked and a conclusion that we draw from it. One of the classic examples is premise number 1, all men are mortal. Premise number 2, Socrates is a man. And the conclusion is, therefore, Socrates is mortal. Now, there's two ways to kind of evaluate syllogisms: whether or not they're valid, which applies only to the structure, and whether or not they're sound, which applies to the content of the premises. You can dig into that more, as I mentioned earlier. But the interesting thing here is that a valid syllogism is one where if the premises are true, the conclusion has to be true. This is something we can demonstrate, and you could look at a syllogism in this formal structure as roughly analogous to doing math with concepts that you can divide it up into set theory or however you want to think about it. Here's a set of all men and they're all mortal, and Socrates is within that group. That's the second premise. And so because he's within that group, he's within the group of things that are mortal, and therefore, transitive property, boom, Socrates is mortal. Because this is the way syllogisms work, people get it in their head that this is all about truth. True premises necessarily lead to true conclusions. But that's not really the case. When we're talking about logical syllogisms, it is about engaging topics such that you have a consistently rational conclusion, such that your worldview perhaps is consistent. And so it doesn't matter so much whether or not the premises are true. What matters is whether or not you accept that they're true, what you are in fact convinced of. Now, it may be the case that not all men are mortal, but if you believe that all men are mortal and you accept that first premise, and you accept the second premise that Socrates is a man, you must accept the conclusion, or you are being irrational. You are in violation of logical rationality, reasonableness, etc. That's the thing that is potentially both beautiful and ugly. So the beautiful part about logical syllogisms is that we have a good understanding. We understand why, if it's valid in structure, that true premises lead to a true conclusion. The beauty is that it allows us to evaluate things cleanly and neatly. Here's a premise, do you accept it? Here's another premise, do you accept that? If so, and the structure is correct, you must accept the conclusion, otherwise you're irrational. It allows us to create a cohesive worldview where we reach conclusions based on what we already accept to be true. The ugly part of this is that people tend to view this as if these are proclamations of truth, as if because I accept this premise and I accept this premise, then the conclusion necessarily follows from that, and therefore it's true. When what we really mean is this conclusion logically follows from the premises that I already accept. There's this idea that we're getting to truth when what we're really doing is getting to accurate conclusions based on things we already accept. And the thing that sometimes gets overlooked is that something that we may accept as true may in fact be wrong. If you structure an argument and you accept one of the premises and you find out that the premise is wrong, what does that do to the argument? Well, it doesn't mean the conclusion's false. This is another problem that people have when they're analyzing arguments. Oh, well, this premise is not true, and therefore the conclusion is not true. No, the conclusion could still in fact be true. It's just you have something wrong with the structure of the argument. This reliance that we have on logic, on reasoning, is beautiful. It's also dangerous. It's in the sense that it could be misused, that people could reach wrong conclusions from it. So if somebody presents a logical argument, what do you do if you think that you accept the premises, but you definitely don't accept the conclusion? This is where you have to actually sit down and do some work. Now, you could just say, nope, I don't buy it. I'm leaving, there's no evidence contained within this, and it's all just pure reasoning, and we'll refer back to the critiques on pure reasoning, etc. And I just, until you can actually present me evidence, I'm not going to accept it. Let's just poo-poo a logical argument. And that would be a big mistake, because you're basically demonstrating that you don't care that much about whether or not your position is justified, or you don't care that much about the argument to find out what's wrong with it. Because it may be the case that you're wrong in rejecting the conclusion. It also may be the case that one of the premises that you accepted when it was first presented, or felt like you accepted, you shouldn't have, that there was not particularly good reason. If you look at something like the Kalam cosmological argument, I've talked about it many times, I'll probably do a video on it at some point, and my default starting point with that is the conclusion of the Kalam cosmological argument just says, therefore the universe had a cause. It doesn't tell you anything about that cause. Everything that they glom on about God is after the fact and separate from that. But that doesn't mean that I'm accepting the Kalam. It doesn't mean that I'm accepting the premises and the conclusion. The structure of it's really simple. Everything that begins to exist has a cause for its existence. The universe began to exist. Therefore, the universe had a cause for its existence. Now, that's valid structure, which means in order to not accept the conclusion, you must then challenge one of the premises. And this is a fundamental key component to logical reasoning. You might have initially just gone with your gut and said, well, of course, everything that begins to exist has a cause for its existence. That just kind of seems intuitively reasonable, but you may need to dig a bit further. You may have to investigate that premise. The second premise, the universe began to exist. What are we talking about? Have we defined our terms? And this is the key thing to evaluating premises, because one of the things that happens frequently is that there's an equivocation fallacy, that a term is used one way in one premise and one way in another premise. In this case, when we're talking about the Kalam, did the universe have a beginning? Well, it depends. You know, if you watch the debate that Sean Carroll did against William Lane Craig, where they were talking about the Borguth-Lincoln model, where Craig's conclusion is that therefore the universe can't be eternal, Sean challenged that, and he also had footage of Alan Guth basically holding up a thing that said something along the lines of, we can't know whether or not the universe is eternal, but I'm currently convinced that it's likely to be eternal based on this. And it was basically saying Craig doesn't understand my model, and I wish he'd stop using it incorrectly to support, you know, his conclusions. So maybe the second premise, the universe began to exist, is in fact wrong, because we're not always talking about the same thing when we talk about the universe. In some cases, we're talking about the local presentation of our universe, the 13.7 billion year old, you know, with the cosmic microwave background radiation. And in other cases, we're talking about something that Sagan referred to as the cosmos, everything that is and was. I like that distinction, even though technically, if you get back to the origins of universe, it's supposed to be one verse, it's supposed to be everything. But then we started engaging in ideas of what is beyond the boundaries of our universe. Is there a boundary to it? Is there anything beyond it? What about prior to the universe? Does it even make sense to talk about before the universe began with notions of time? We started investigating ideas about multiverses and things, and all of these are thought experiments and interesting ideas that led us to say, you know, we need a word that applies to everything. So I like Sagan's use of the word cosmos, because within the cosmos, it could be identical to our universe. Our universe is the sum total of all the cosmos. Or it could be that the cosmos exists and our universe exists as a part of it. We don't know, because these things are potentially beyond our ability to investigate. There's an interesting thing that happens, a way to use logical arguments to sort of test something. It's commonly called, or well, not commonly called among logicians, a reductio ad absurdum argument. And that is, you insert a premise that is questionable into a syllogism that has a valid structure, so you can see what conclusion is derived from it. And if you can demonstrate that this conclusion is false, and that your second premise is actually true, then whatever premise you inserted at the beginning can't be true. The ability to do this is based on this idea that if we have two true premises, we're going to get a true conclusion. If you have one true premise and one false premise, you don't know whether or not your conclusion is true. You just can't get there. The non sequitur, it doesn't follow. And so if you're presented with an argument and it intuitively feels like you should accept the premises, and you don't want to investigate further, and you dismiss the conclusion from it, you are engaged in irrationality. It doesn't tell us anything at all about what's true. It doesn't tell us whether or not you're correct in your dismissal of the conclusion. What it tells us is that you didn't want to do the legwork to figure out where you might have went wrong, where the person presenting the argument might have went wrong, and what the case should be. So what do we do when we're in that position? Well, hopefully you'll be interested in actually doing the work. Hopefully you'll want to go through and examine the premises to find out whether or not you should have accepted them. One of the aspects of evaluating logical arguments comes from an idea that we trust the structure and we don't trust the content. And so if there's a premise that's questionable, the first thing we should ask is, Is there argument and hopefully evidence, because it would be nice, ultimately things need to be supported by evidence. The reason we believe all men are mortal is because that is what the evidence points us to. That as far as we can tell, every human being who has ever lived has died, apart from the ones who are still living, that we all reach our eventual point and that we're mortal. This is where the evidence points us to, and this is why we accept the premise. But each premise could be the conclusion of another argument. For example, everybody who's ever existed, has died, except for those who are still alive and under 150 or whatever. Maybe you want to have a conversation about what's the maximum amount of time a human could live. Well, if you're going from a biblical standpoint, you could go up to Methuselah at 969, I think it is, and Noah started building his ark at 600. And you could make a reductio ad absurdum argument to show that not only do we not have evidence for these claims that people lived that long, but we have pretty good evidence against it from what we know about lifespans and what we know about possible lifespans. But each premise that you want to challenge, it's pretty easy to try to come up with another argument that has that premise as its conclusion. It becomes this structure where we take the things that we know and understand, the things that we agree to be true, the things that we accept are true, the things that we believe, it doesn't matter how you want to phrase it, and we build off of what we know. These two things lead to this conclusion, which becomes a premise in this argument, along with this, which leads to this conclusion, which becomes a premise in this argument. We continue down that way. We build off of what we know. And logical arguments, especially in the simplified structure of a syllogism, is what allows us to do that. But we're not perfect thinkers. People are going to make mistakes. We're going to find things that we became convinced of for bad reasons, and they got worked into the system to where now you have a muddled heuristic, and now you're less likely to reach an accurate or reasonable conclusion. The ugly part, the ugly truth about the logical arguments is the fact that they're misunderstood, that people don't devote the time to them, that people make assumptions that they are testaments of truth instead of what they actually are, which is a tool to guide our thinking, a reliable tool that allows us to develop a consistent and reasonable model of the world in our head. And that's where the beautiful part of it comes in. Because when it's done right, there's a reason that it's analogous to math. It is wholeheartedly reliable if it's done right. You can demonstrate this with the simple propositions, the example that we used earlier. You can also show it using set theory with abstract notions. A circle with A, a circle with B, where they overlap. You figure out what goes in there. Venn diagrams and set theory are amazing tools that are really just logical syllogisms put into a visual format. And if that's the way that you learn, if that's the thing that makes it easier for you to understand, do some studying on Venn diagrams and set theory and learn how to map out the categories of things that you're comparing to figure out where they are. Logic isn't a scary thing. It's not just for philosophers. It's not just for logicians. It is math with words. It is all tied to the foundations of understanding. It's a beautiful thing that nobody should be afraid of. The fact that what some people tend to see right off the bat is P, arrow, Q, and all these symbols. If you are not familiar with symbolic logic, it is terrifying because it kind of begins by exposing that you don't even have a foundation upon which to talk about. And I'm not particularly conversant with symbolic logic. I know enough to get by. I know enough to be able to convert things into the way that I approach problems and find it easier. But learning about logical fallacies is important. Learning about the structure of logical syllogisms and how to challenge and combat them, how to say, this premise that you presented, along with this other premise, I think I accept this one, but I'm not so sure about this one. And if you're in a conversation with somebody who has presented their argument and you respond by challenging their premise, this puts us in an incredibly interesting point in the conversation Because what I've seen is the people who are just regurgitating a logical argument that they've heard from somebody else, as soon as you challenge a premise, you've thrown them off their script. And now that, well, what do you mean the universe didn't have a beginning? That's just blah, blah, blah. And of course, they're probably not experts in cosmology and cosmological origins, none of this stuff. They are relying on what they learned elsewhere, and they may not have a sufficient founding to defend their premises. And so what sometimes they will do is say, oh, well, my premise stands until you prove it wrong, which I think most of us are aware is a shifting of the burden of proof. If they are the one presenting an argument and you are not convinced of one of their premises, or if you have questions, there needs to be a conversation where terms are defined, and either they present you with the argument that has that premise as its conclusion so that you can evaluate it and you may or may not accept it, or the empirical evidence that actually serves as the foundation for that premise. So if you're presented with an argument and something about it feels wrong, but you can't put your finger on it, and well, I'm not a logician, let me just throw my hands up in the air, and I don't want to have this conversation, and show me evidence, I need something, I don't care about philosophy and arguments and stuff like that. I would encourage you to avoid going down that route. It doesn't take a great deal of effort to get some of the basics, but it takes almost no effort to say, I'm not convinced of this. Can you spell this out? Can we get a definition here? Can you show me how you reach the conclusion that the universe had a beginning, for example? What do we mean by universe right here, and what do we mean by beginning? That sort of question will tell you so much more about whether or not the person you're speaking to has a good understanding of this, or whether or not they've just been handed a script. You don't have to know everything about logical arguments. I don't. As a matter of fact, I don't know anybody who really does. I know logic professors, philosophy professors, who are going to struggle with certain things at certain times. That's fine. That's who we are. This gets back to this idea that if you don't believe something, it doesn't have to be a God thing, pick your subject. But if you are not convinced of it, and someone is trying to convince you of it with an argument, then that argument deserves incredible scrutiny. We need to be clear about definitions. We need to make sure that we have evidential support wherever possible. But don't look at it as demonstrating that it's true. Look at it as convincing you that it's likely true and that you could still be wrong, so that even if you accept premises and the conclusion that follows from them, you can still go back and evaluate this later. None of your positions should be rock solid, absolute certainty. They should be tentative positions subject to revision as you learn and understand more. To quote Spock, logic is the beginning of wisdom. This video is made possible by supporters of the Atheist Debates Patreon project. You can find more information and add your support at patreon.com/atheistdebates.